This story is far from over. What started as an act of prejudice has spiraled into a shocking chain of events that no one saw coming. If you missed part one, the link is in the comments. Watch it first to understand how we got here. Today we uncover the truth and lives will be forever changed. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. The video raced across the internet, an accusation, a mother's intervention, and a stunned crowd left to question everything. The world took notice. News anchors dissected every second. Hashtags surged on social media. And voices from every corner of the country, demanded accountability. At the center of it all was Sarah, a woman whose actions set this storm in motion. Her accusations, once whispered in the quiet of a park, were now echoing through newsrooms, living rooms, and on streets where protesters gathered. Outside her home, signs were held high. The words were impossible to ignore. Enough is enough. But this story is far from over. What happens when a single act of injustice unravels years of hidden truths? When one moment forces a community to ask, how did we let this happen for so long? As we reflect on this real-life story, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more daily stories that need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Sarah thought the worst was over when the crowd dispersed from the park. She was wrong. Within hours, her name, her face, and her actions were everywhere, on every screen, in every conversation. Employers called emergency meetings, friends stopped returning her messages, and outside her home, voices grew louder. Protesters held signs that cut through any defense she might have mustered. She tried to explain herself in an interview, sitting stiffly before the camera, searching for the right words. "I was just concerned," she stammered. But her explanations were met with blank stares. Her words were hollow, her excuses unraveling as quickly as her carefully constructed life. What Sarah didn't know was that her past was catching up to her. While the video of the park incident ignited a public outcry, it also opened the door to deeper revelations. One phone call, just one, was all it took to set the wheels in motion. A black neighbor of Sarah's contacted Mayor Thompson's office. The voice on the other end trembled with a mix of anger and exhaustion, recounting years of fear and frustration. "She's done this before," the neighbor said. "She's been targeting us for years." The story spilled out. A delivery driver, young and black, falsely accused by Sarah of stealing a package. The accusation led to his arrest. The charges were baseless, the trauma lasting. And this wasn't an isolated case. Mayor Thompson listened. Every detail painted a more troubling picture. It wasn't just one incident in the park. It was a pattern. The mayor made her decision quickly. Action was no longer an option. It was a necessity. She brought in a private investigator with the skills to uncover what Sarah had spent years hiding. No stone would be left unturned. The investigator began combing through records, files, and testimonies. And what he uncovered would not only shock the community, it would demand justice. Jeremiah had always found comfort in the rhythm of his days. The park was his sanctuary, a place where he could sit beneath the trees and feel the world slow down. But after that day, the world didn't slow down. It closed in. At school, whispers trailed behind him. "That's him," they murmured, their words carrying a weight he couldn't escape. Everywhere he went, he felt the label, the boy from the video. Even his teachers seemed uncertain. Their concern was well-meaning, but their lingering looks and carefully phrased questions only reminded him of the event he desperately wanted to forget. Anxiety wrapped itself around him, tightening its grip with each passing day. At night, his dreams replayed the scene in the park. The accusing tone, the flashing lights, the cold professionalism of the officers who didn't seem to hear his side. He woke up gasping for air, the fear clinging to him like a second skin. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner, his mother pulled up a chair. Mayor Angela Thompson wasn't just his mom that night, she was his anchor. "Talk to me," she said, her voice steady but soft. Jeremiah hesitated, unsure of where to begin. "It feels like everyone's watching me," he finally admitted, "like they're waiting for me to mess up." His mother listened, letting him pour out the frustration and fear he'd kept bottled up. When he finished, she leaned closer, her eyes unwavering. Jeremiah, I know this feels impossible right now, but your voice matters. What happened to you wasn't right, and you have every reason to feel angry. But you also have the power to turn this into something bigger than yourself. Your story could help others see the truth and push for change. Her words didn't erase his fear, but they planted something else, a sense of purpose. In the days that followed, Jeremiah found himself drawn to a local youth group dedicated to fighting racial inequality. He sat quietly during the first meeting, unsure if his story belonged alongside theirs. But as he listened, he realized he wasn't alone. One by one, the group members shared their experiences, moments of bias, moments of pain, moments where they had been made to feel small. And slowly, Jeremiah began to speak. He told them about the park, the accusations, and the suffocating fear of not being believed. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope. The group wasn't just talking, they were taking action. They organized marches, wrote petitions, and spoke at local events. Jeremiah wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time since that day in the park, he felt like he was moving forward. It wasn't easy, and the fear didn't disappear overnight. But with every story he told, with every meeting he attended, Jeremiah began to see that his voice mattered. And in a world that had tried to silence him, that was enough to keep going. The wheels of justice often move slowly, but when the truth begins to emerge, it can't be ignored. For Sarah, the public backlash was only the beginning. When Mayor Thompson enlisted the help of a private investigator, it wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Someone had to look beyond the surface, to piece together a pattern that stretched further than anyone could have imagined. The investigators sifted through years of records, uncovering a pattern hidden in plain sight. Each case, each report, pointed to the same troubling reality. Sarah wasn't just the woman in the park. She had a history, a trail of incidents where her words had caused irreparable harm. Report after report revealed the same troubling story. Sarah had repeatedly used the police as a weapon against her black neighbors. A teenager delivering flyers was accused of trespassing. A young woman waiting for a rideshare was labeled suspicious. Each call painted a false picture of danger, each one based on nothing more than Sarah's prejudice. And then came the most damning discovery. One police report, buried in a stack of files, told the story of a black man accused of theft. Sarah's testimony had been crucial in his conviction. The evidence was flimsy, the case riddled with inconsistencies, but her word had been enough to send him to prison. He had spent 2 years behind bars before his sentence was overturned. The damage to his life was permanent, his freedom stolen by a lie. As the investigation's findings reached the mayor's office, the media caught wind of the story. Headlines splashed across screens, exposing Sarah's long history of false accusations. The footage of Jeremiah's encounter in the park was replayed alongside interviews with Sarah's former neighbors, each sharing their chilling accounts. Protests swelled, the chants louder than ever. Signs bearing the face of the wrongfully imprisoned man were held high, his name now a rallying cry for justice. "No more lies, no more lives," they shouted. The outrage wasn't just directed at Sarah. The officer who had questioned Jeremiah that day found himself under scrutiny. His actions were reviewed in painstaking detail, and his biases were laid bare. Internal investigations revealed procedural violations. He had taken Sarah's word without question, ignoring Jeremiah's every attempt to explain. The department issued a public statement announcing the officer's termination. "Accountability is essential," the statement read. But for many, it was too little, too late. Sarah's actions weren't just personal, they were systemic, highlighting how prejudice can exploit power structures to devastating effect. And as the revelations continued to unfold, one question hung heavy in the air. How many more lives had been affected? The investigation had done more than expose Sarah's actions. It had ignited a firestorm, forcing an entire community to confront the consequences of unchecked bias and the systems that enable it. Justice, though often delayed, had finally arrived at Sarah's door. The investigation's findings left no room for doubt. With the evidence laid bare, authorities moved swiftly. Sarah was arrested, her charges reflecting the weight of her actions, making false police reports, perjury, and causing harm through malicious intent. The courtroom was silent as the trial began. One by one, the stories were retold. Jeremiah in the park, the delivery driver falsely accused, the innocent man who had lost years of his life to a wrongful conviction. Each account painted a vivid picture of how Sarah's words had destroyed trust, shattered lives, and abused a system designed to protect. The judge's voice was steady, but each word carried undeniable gravity. "Your actions were not isolated incidents," he said, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "You exploited your privilege, weaponized the trust placed in you, and caused immeasurable harm. This court cannot ignore the pattern of behavior you have exhibited." Sarah was sentenced to jail, a measure of accountability for those she had harmed, and a reminder that justice, though overdue, can still be delivered. For Sarah, the reality of her punishment was inescapable. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in as she was led away in handcuffs. No cameras followed her now, no microphones sought her comments. The woman who had once wielded power with a phone call was now stripped of the control she had so often misused. In the stillness of her cell, Sarah had nothing left but time. Time to replay the choices that had led her here. The faces of those she had wronged seemed etched into the walls around her. The delivery driver's shock, Jeremiah's fear, the silent anguish of the wrongfully imprisoned man. Each memory weighed heavily on her. For the first time, she began to understand the ripple effects of her actions. Her regret was real, but it came too late to undo the damage she had caused. Her punishment was not just a personal reckoning. It was a message to others who might consider using their privilege as a weapon. The city council chamber was packed, rows of seats filled with community members, their faces a mix of curiosity, determination, and hope. Journalists lined the back wall, cameras ready to capture every moment. This was more than a meeting. It was a turning point. At the center of it all was Jeremiah. Seated quietly beside his mother, his hands rested on the paper that held the speech he had rewritten a dozen times. This wasn't a moment he had sought, but it was one he had embraced. When his name was called, Jeremiah rose, the weight of every eye in the room settling on him. The microphone crackled faintly as he adjusted it, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't want to be here," he began. The room instantly silent. "I didn't want to be the kid in that video. I didn't want to feel afraid just for sitting in a park. But what I want doesn't matter, because this isn't just about me." His words carried the weight of lived experience, cutting through the air with precision. He spoke of the fear that had gripped him in those moments, of the injustice that still clung to him, and of the countless others who had faced the same, but lacked the platform to be heard. "Racial profiling doesn't just hurt the people it targets," Jeremiah continued, his voice gaining strength. "It hurts entire communities. It builds walls of distrust, and it tears apart the very fabric that's supposed to hold us together." His words landed like a ripple, reaching every corner of the room. Some council members shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, captivated. The silence that followed his speech wasn't one of indifference. It was the kind of stillness born from reflection. Mayor Thompson took the floor next, presenting her proposed reforms. Her voice was measured, but her message was clear. "We cannot undo the past," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "But we can ensure that no one else endures what Jeremiah has endured." The reforms were sweeping: mandatory anti-bias training for city employees and police officers, strict penalties for racially motivated false reports, and the creation of a community task force to address racial inequities head-on. Each proposal was met with murmurs of approval, some louder than others. When the council cast their votes, the decision was unanimous. The policies were approved, marking a new chapter for the city. The applause that followed wasn't just for the reforms, it was for the courage it took to demand them. As the meeting adjourned, Jeremiah stood among a sea of supporters. Strangers shook his hand, thanking him for his bravery. And though the journey had been painful, he realized something profound. His story, once a source of fear, was now a beacon of hope. The policies were just the beginning. The conversation sparked by this moment would continue in living rooms, classrooms, and community halls. The change wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. And for the first time in weeks, the city felt like it was moving towards something better. The ripple effects of that fateful day didn't end in the courtroom or the council chamber. They extended into the heart of the community, touching lives in ways that were both profound and enduring. Jeremiah, once a boy burdened by fear and confusion, found a new purpose. As an ambassador for racial justice, he stood at the forefront of local initiatives aimed at building understanding and bridging divides. His voice became a symbol of resilience, his story a reminder of the power of standing up and speaking out. In Oakwood Park, where the story began, a mural stretches across a brick wall. Vibrant colors depict unity, strength, and the faces of those who stood for change. The park, once the site of confrontation, became a gathering place for celebrations, conversations, and progress. The community, once fractured by prejudice, began to heal. Conversations once avoided were now embraced. Families, neighbors, and leaders worked together to create a space where justice was more than an aspiration, a shared commitment. But this story isn't just about one city or one moment. It's a call to action for anyone who witnesses injustice and feels the weight of silence when words are needed most. What will you do when prejudice confronts you? Will you stand by or will you stand up? Change starts with a single step. Jeremiah took his. The question now is, what step will you take? Join our community of people who believe in justice, empathy, and powerful storytelling. By subscribing, you're not just watching, you're part of a movement that values real stories and change. Add us to your daily routine and make every story count. Subscribe and join us each day for stories that make an impact.